In the small town of Riverton, nestled among the hills of Pennsylvania, life flowed smoothly and calmly. Here, everyone knew each other. And the local St. Peter's Church, located in the very center, was not just a place of worship, but the heart of the entire community. It was here that Riverton residents came to find solace, share joy, or simply hear the kind words of Father John O'Connor, a priest who had served the town for over a decade. Father John was a man to whom advice was sought, and his words were often decisive in matters both spiritual and temporal. But it was his unyielding outlook on life and belief in his own infallibility that would soon become the center of a terrible scandal, shaking Riverton to its very foundations. Sarah Thompson, a 30-year-old woman with a heart of gold, was one of the most devoted members of the church. Everyone knew her, from the children for whom she organized Sunday lessons to the elderly whom she helped around the house. Sarah was that rare person who always found time for others, forgetting about her own needs. Her bright smile and kind eyes became a symbol of kindness in this small town. But no one could have imagined that it was in this church, among the walls saturated with prayers and hopes, that an event would occur that would make everyone doubt what they knew about life and death, good and evil. One day at the beginning of a cold November, Sarah suddenly disappeared. She was not seen at Sunday services or in the city park, where she usually walked with neighboring children. Phone calls went unanswered, and her home appeared to be hastily abandoned. This caused alarm among residents, and within a few days, the search began. No one expected that Sarah would be found dead, much less in the holiest place in the city. But this was only the beginning of a long and painful story that would reveal the dark sides of the human soul and force the city of Riverton to face a truth from which it was impossible to hide, even behind the walls of the church. It all started with a body found in a quiet, darkened parish room, the body of Sarah Thompson. Her death was not just a tragedy. It was a brutal murder, committed with such cold determination that no one could believe the man to whom they trusted their deepest secrets was behind it. The investigation of this crime was supposed to destroy trust and lives. But until this moment, before everything became known, the residents of Riverton still believed that evil could not penetrate their quiet corner. However, with each passing hour, with each new discovery by detectives, it became clear that true evil could hide even in the most righteous hearts. Thus began a story that shook the city to its core. Soon, every resident of Riverton realized that no one was safe from the darkness hidden behind the mask of holiness. A cold autumn wind blew through the streets of Riverton, stripping the last leaves from the trees. It seemed like a normal day, a bustling market, children playing in the schoolyard and the sound of bells echoing in the empty alleys. But something was wrong. There was tension in the air, subtle but persistent, as if nature itself was warning of impending disaster. In the morning hours, when the city was just waking up, Emily Carter timidly knocked on the door of St. Peter's Church. She came as she did every Sunday to help Father John prepare the church for the service. Usually, Sarah was already there, tending to flowers or arranging candles, but today the church greeted Emily with silence, a strange, dull silence that spread across the empty benches and dimmed the light in the stained glass windows. Emily called out for Sarah, her voice echoing throughout the empty hall, but there was no answer. At first, she decided that her friend was simply delayed, but slight anxiety gradually began to develop into fear. Her intuition told her that something was wrong. This feeling did not leave her as she walked through the dark corridors of the church, heading towards the rooms where the priest and parishioners usually held conversations. It was there, in a small room closed to parishioners, that Emily discovered something that would change her life forever. The light of the lamp, barely breaking through the half-open door, revealed a terrifying sight. On the floor among scattered books and papers lay the body of Sarah Thompson. Emily did not immediately understand what was in front of her. It was too unexpected, too unimaginable. Sarah's body was mutilated beyond recognition, and the first thing Emily felt was not fear, but an inexplicable emptiness, as if reality had suddenly lost its meaning. She screamed, but her scream was drowned in the walls of the church. Time seemed to stand still. The thought that her friend was dead did not immediately penetrate her consciousness. At that moment, Emily could not understand how and who could commit such an atrocity. Sarah's body was covered with bloody marks, and her face was so disfigured that she could only be recognized by her clothes and jewelry. But this horror was not the only thing that shocked Emily. Behind Sarah's body, a little to the side on the floor, lay a bloody cross, a symbol that the church, which they considered a refuge, had now become a place of murder. This was not just an act of violence. It was a message, dark and merciless, thrown into the very heart of faith and trust. Soon the police arrived at the scene. Their heavy footsteps echoed through the hallways as they examined the body and crime scene. There were more questions than answers. Who could commit such a brutal crime in a place that was supposed to be holy, and why? Allison Harper, a detective known for her keen intelligence and professionalism, took on this case, feeling that it would be one of the most difficult of her career. Allison immediately noticed some oddities. Firstly, the crime scene seemed too clean, despite all its brutality. There were no signs of a struggle, which was strange given the state of Sarah's body. In addition, her personal belongings were in place, ruling out the possibility of robbery. Everything indicated that the killer knew Sarah and acted with cold-blooded confidence. Looking around the room, Allison noticed scattered books and papers, many of them of religious content. Everything indicated that Sarah was often in this room, but what made her come here on that fateful day? Perhaps she met someone she trusted but who turned on her. While the forensics team collected evidence, Allison began to analyze possible motives. This murder did not appear to be random. On the contrary, it seemed carefully planned and symbolic, as if the killer wanted to send some kind of message. But what exactly did he want to say? The city was shocked by the news of the brutal murder. Residents could not believe that something so terrible could happen in their quiet corner, where people always left their doors unlocked and greeted each other with smiles. The church, which had always been a symbol of light and hope, was now covered in the shadow of fear and suspicion. Allison understood that a long and difficult path to the truth awaited her. This murder was supposed to be just the beginning, the very catalyst that would bring out the dark secrets hidden behind the facade of decency and faith. And she was ready to plunge into this darkness to find answers to the questions that now tormented all of Riverton. With the first rays of the sun breaking through the thick curtain of clouds, Riverton woke up in a completely different reality. The murder of Sarah Thompson was a shock that ran through every home, every family in the city. Rumors spread with lightning speed, and each resident seemed to know more than his neighbor, adding his own version of events. However, at the center of all the talk and speculation was one question: who could commit such a terrible crime? Meanwhile, for detectives Allison Harper and Mark Ridgway, this morning was no different from any other, if not for the terrible events that unfolded the day before. Allison, barely closing her eyes after a sleepless night, was already sitting in the office, looking through forensic reports and searching for any detail that could shed light on this case. Mark, although he looked calm, felt internal tension. In the city where they both spent more than 1 year, murder was so rare that each case became special, but this one turned out to be simply out of the ordinary. The first thing that struck Allison when examining the reports was that there were no signs of a struggle. This meant that Sarah either trusted her killer or was caught off guard. However, she was even more surprised by the condition of the body. The injuries inflicted indicated that the crime had been committed with particular cruelty. Forensic investigators discovered that the murder weapon, a knife, was left at the crime scene. This seemed unusual since most killers try to get rid of the weapon to complicate the investigation. But this criminal seemed to want to leave a message. That was what bothered Allison the most. Mark, meanwhile, was collecting information about Sarah. Her life seemed, at first glance, impeccable: a loving family, active participation in the life of the city, devotion to the church. But Mark knew that behind the facade of perfection, there were often hidden secrets that could shed light on true motives. He began by interrogating her relatives, friends, and acquaintances, trying to build a complete portrait of her life and her last days. Many described Sarah as kind and sympathetic, but some hinted at her recent withdrawal and anxiety, which she seemed to hide from everyone. Mark's first interrogation led him to Emily Carter, Sarah's friend who discovered her body. Emily was in shock and still couldn't believe what had happened. However, overcoming her emotions, she told Mark that in recent weeks, Sarah had become more withdrawn, often lost in her thoughts, and even avoided discussing church matters, which had previously been her favorite topic. Emily noticed that Sarah began to come to church alone late in the evening when there was no one there, and something was bothering her, but she never shared what it was. Allison, meanwhile, decided to focus on the crime scene itself. She understood that the key to the solution could be hidden in little things that at first glance might seem insignificant. Father John O'Connor volunteered to help her with the examination, and although his help was offered with the best intentions, something about his behavior seemed unnatural to Allison. The priest was unnaturally calm for a man who knew the murdered woman personally and saw her body in such a terrible state. This caught Allison's attention, and she decided to take a closer look at him. Father John was a man with a complex character. He was strict but fair, and although his faith was undoubted, sometimes there were notes in his sermons that alarmed some parishioners. He was a strict adherent, and followed the canons with a rigidity that could seem intimidating. Allison decided it was worth looking into his past, to see if there were events in his life that could shed light on the current investigation. Among the documents Allison studied were many church books and records, but one caught her attention: Sarah's journal. This diary was not only a record of her thoughts, but also a testimony of her experiences in the last weeks before her death. There were notes about her doubts, internal torment, and fears. One of the last entries spoke of a man in the dark who haunted her even in church. This alarmed Allison even more. Meanwhile, Mark learned that the priest was the only one who did not provide a clear alibi for the night of the murder. He claimed that he was in church praying, but no one could confirm his words. This further increased suspicions in his direction, but there was no direct evidence yet. Allison and Mark began to realize that the investigation was just beginning, and that there were many secrets ahead that they would have to uncover. The key moment was the realization that behind the facade of a quiet town, there were many skeletons, and Sarah's murder might be just the tip of the iceberg. Every step, every new piece of evidence brought more and more questions. Although the answers were not yet available, the detectives were determined to get to the bottom of the truth. The foggy morning found Riverton immersed in anxious anticipation. The murder of Sarah Thompson became the main topic of conversation on the streets, in shops, and even in homes. In a town where the priest was the embodiment of moral principles and spiritual guidance, doubts now began to creep in. People whispered that perhaps something dark and terrible was hidden behind the facade of piety. Father John O'Connor, who had always been a bastion of calm and confidence, now found himself under suspicion. His behavior after the murder raised more and more questions. Even those who had previously considered him the steadfast leader of the community began to notice changes. He became more withdrawn, avoided communication, and seemed to become increasingly lost in his own thoughts. Detectives Allison Harper and Mark Ridgway began to carefully study the priest's past. They knew that behind each mask, there could be something hiding that explained current events. Research into his life led them to amazing discoveries. John O'Connor was born and raised in a strict religious family. From a very early age, he was prepared for service in the church and was brought up in the spirit of unquestioning obedience to religious canons. His parents, men of iron will and uncompromising convictions, instilled in him strict moral principles that guided his life. But the deeper the detectives delved into his past, the more details emerged that contradicted his impeccable image. Mark found information that John had served in another diocese for several years before ending up in Riverton. In those years of his service, not everything was smooth. Several parishioners complained about his excessive severity and harsh methods of raising children in the church school. One of these complaints even led to an investigation, but the matter was hushed up, and John was simply transferred to another parish. Allison, in turn, began to study his behavior in recent months. What caught her attention was that several people who had previously been close to John gradually began to distance themselves from him. She spoke with Amelia Ross, the church secretary who knew John best. Amelia was a devoted servant and always supported the priest, but recently she noticed that he had become more withdrawn and irritable. Amelia also mentioned the strange conversation she overheard between John and Sarah. These conversations, she said, were intense, but she could not understand their essence. Allison and Mark also noted that John was the last person to see Sarah in the church on the day of her death. He claimed that they were discussing church matters and Sarah seemed a little worried, but that was the end of their conversation. However, John's testimony did not match the timeline of events. Several witnesses claimed to have seen him leaving the church much later than he claimed. Allison began to realize that John may not be who he says he is. His connection with Sarah turned out to be much deeper than just the relationship between a priest and a parishioner. In her diary, which Allison found earlier, there were references to a man in black who often visited her in church and tried to convince her of something. These notes became increasingly disturbing as the day of her death approached. She wrote that she felt trapped and did not know how to get out of the current situation. However, so far there has been no direct evidence of the priest's guilt. His alibi, although it seemed dubious, still could not be disproved. But Allison and Mark knew they had to dig deeper. The question was not only who killed Sarah but also why it happened. What did Sarah know that could make the priest or someone from his circle commit such a terrible crime? Meanwhile, the residents of Riverton began to suspect that the matter might be more complicated than they thought. More and more people began to move away from the church, feeling that their faith had been undermined. It wasn't just a crisis of faith, It was the realization that the man they trusted could be hiding a horrifying secret. Suspicions and fears began to eat away at the calm of the city, turning it from a quiet corner into a place where anyone could be a suspect. Allison and Mark decided to focus on the evidence to avoid making a mistake. They understood that they could deal with a person who skillfully hides his true intentions. But the truth always comes out. They were determined to find out what really happened on that fateful day when Sarah Thompson was killed. As detectives continued to delve deeper into the case, the atmosphere in Riverton became increasingly tense every day. The city, once calm and friendly, now seemed immersed in a fog of suspicion and mistrust. The murder of Sarah Thompson and suspicions about Father John O'Connor turned the community into a place where anyone could become the target of rumors. Conversations began with innocent questions, which quickly escalated into heated discussions and ultimately into accusations. In a local cafe where residents gathered to discuss the latest news, the topic of murder became the main topic. Someone remembered seeing Sarah late in the evening near the church. Others mentioned strange changes in the behavior of Father John. Everything seemed important, even the smallest details, and everyone considered it their duty to share information that could shed light on the crime. One of the most discussed topics was the connection between Sarah and the priest. Many knew that Sarah spent a lot of time in the church, often helped with organizing events, and was close to Father John. But now, after her murder, this closeness began to seem suspicious. People began to wonder what exactly connected them. Was it just a spiritual connection or something more? Amelia Ross, the church secretary, was also drawn into this whirlpool of rumors. She was the only one who worked side by side with Father John every day, and the villagers began to suspect that she might know something. But she remained silent. Some even suggested that she could be involved in the murder, since she was always nearby and knew all the internal affairs of the parish. Allison and Mark, realizing that rumors could not only fuel interest in the case but also complicate the investigation, decided to begin a series of meetings with local residents. Their goal was not only to gather more information, but also to try to calm tensions in the community. However, they quickly realized that stopping the flow of gossip would not be easy. At one of these meetings, they ran into John Miller, a local journalist who had been actively covering the investigation. He seemed to know everything about the detective's every move, and willingly shared his thoughts with anyone who would listen. John was sure that there was more to the matter than just jealousy or personal scores. He even suggested that the murder could be connected to dark rituals or ancient rites that the priest allegedly performed in secret. Allison, although skeptical, realized that John could have important information, especially if he was communicating with people who were afraid to speak directly to the police. She decided to take note of some of his assumptions, although she did not consider them paramount. Meanwhile, Mark focused on interrogating members of the church parish. He noticed that many of them who had previously supported Father John were now starting to distance themselves from him. Some parishioners even admitted that they felt uncomfortable during the last sermons when the priest spoke about sin and redemption with special passion, almost with a threat. These words began to seem to them like a harbinger of something terrible, and now they could not help but feel that there was a hidden threat in his words. But the most surprising thing was that some of the most devoted parishioners began to doubt their faith. They could not understand how the person to whom they trusted their souls could be involved in such a terrible crime. These doubts penetrated their hearts and began to destroy the foundations on which their whole life rested. At the same time, Emily Carter, Sarah's friend who remained one of the few who still believed in the innocence of Father John, became the object of condemnation from her neighbors. Her faith in the priest seemed absurd in the eyes of those who had already condemned him for his crime, and Emily began to feel cold alienation from those whom she considered friends. Her support for the priest began to seem strange, and this only increased the suspicions around her. Allison and Mark knew the situation was getting out of control. The tension in the city could lead to unpredictable consequences, and they decided to speed up the investigation to prevent further discord in the community. They began to check every detail, every piece of evidence even more carefully, trying to find something that would help them bring the true killer to light. But so far the answers were far away, and suspicions were multiplying. In the shadows of the quiet town, fears lurked and began to surface. More mysteries awaited them ahead, and every step seemed to bring them closer to a solution but also to new questions. The investigation entered a phase when each new piece of evidence not only did not bring clarity, but also confused the case even more. Allison and Mark felt like they were getting closer to something important, but with every step, they realized that this investigation was more complicated than they could have imagined. Each new fact that surfaced seemed contradictory and complicated the overall picture. One of the first problems was that the testimony of witnesses began to differ. Some residents claimed to have seen Sarah and Father John together the evening before her death, while others insisted that the priest had already left the church when Sarah arrived there. Allison understood that people could make mistakes, but the number of inconsistencies was alarming. Mark decided to go back to the beginning of the investigation and review the evidence collected at the crime scene. He noticed some details that had previously been missed. In particular, he was interested in fingerprints found on the knife and cross used in the murder. It was initially assumed that all the prints belonged to Sarah and Father John, but after rechecking, it turned out that traces of another person had been found.